The key information today is going to be from a good friend of mine and a good friend probably to a lot of you, John Weaver. I love John. Anyway, so let me just stop talking, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. John Weaver, who's going to talk about wellness in the mind.
I'm ready to start. Thank you.
Awesome.
What a great introduction. I haven't had one like that where I've been told that I'm loved even before I start. That's a cool thing. I've got a lot to cover today, and so I'm going to try to divide it up a little bit as we go through things. My goals are that you'll be able to kind of have an idea of what goes on in the brain, kind of how it works, and how things are organized, and understand that it's a good deal more complex than we often think, because we tend to reduce it to a particular part as we're looking at it. But we'll take a kind of a quick walk through all of that, and then take a look at how we are understanding better how the brain works, and these insights help us to really increase our effectiveness in promoting healthy lifestyle choices over the long term. And I'd like to try to address some of the issues that I think we often encounter with wellness, where getting that kind of long-term change is really the gold standard, and what we can do about it to be more effective for that. And then just spend a little bit of time talking about some systematic ways to go about doing this, and why that turns out to be an extremely important thing. So if we can cover at least most of that during the next hour, I'll be pretty happy that we've accomplished what we're trying to accomplish. So let's start by diving in a little bit, and I want to start by identifying how the brain is structured on a number of different levels. So the basic unit that when I was being given my neurology classes, my neuropsychology classes, we started with is the nerve cell. And a good deal of neuroscience research for the last 30 or 40 years has been focused on how nerve cells work. We're not going to spend a significant period of time on this, but just so that you have kind of an idea, there's a cell body, which you see in the diagram here. There are dendrites, and the dendrites are kind of like branches on a tree. There are numbers of them that branch out, and they connect to other nerve cells. The estimate is that there are about 5 trillion connections that are made within the brain from nerve cell to nerve cell. I have a hard time understanding what 5 trillion looks like, so if that seems overwhelming, I think it's sufficient to say a lot. Then there's a part of the cell that we call the axon, and that goes down to an area of the cell that releases chemicals and signals to connect to the next nerve cell. Most of the medications that are used for depression and anxiety have focused on trying to change the functioning of the nerve cells, and there are ways that we've been successful in being able to help people with medication. There are also problems with that, and I'm not going to get into that today because we won't have time to spend doing all of that. But just to to start to kind of get familiar with the fact that there are nerve cells. The next thing that was very obvious, and actually the thing that was obvious first to people when they looked at cells before we had electron microscopes and things like that, is that it seemed to be divided into what we call lobes. So there are several lobes of the brain. In the front of the head, above the forehead, is something called the frontal lobe. At the top of the head is the parietal lobe. The rear is the occipital lobe, and right around the ear is something called the temporal lobe. There's been a good deal of effort trying to understand how these different lobes of the brain work. Essentially, kind of roughly, we understand that the parietal lobes are responsible for movement, so that when you're moving or feeling something, the parietal lobes seem to be most active. The occipital lobe at the very back of the head, interestingly enough, is the part of the brain that seems to be responsible for getting visual input. So when we're seeing, the back of our head actually is the part of the brain that seems to be most active. Hearing takes place in the temporal lobe. Also, formation of speech kind of overlaps with temporal, frontal, and parietal lobe. We have kind of this speech areas roughly represented there, and then the frontal lobe is the part of the brain where we engage in kind of voluntary activity. So we have these kinds of rough patterns, and I say rough because they're not exactly the same in every person's experience. Most of what we've discovered about how these areas work is been primarily studying people who have had damage to those areas of the brain, and what we find is that there's a good deal more integration of all of these areas than most people in the past really understood. So parietal and occipital and temporal all integrate to help us to be able to combine seeing and hearing and moving all in one very smooth motion, which turns out to be quite important in the way that we conduct ourselves, so that we wouldn't be able to move very effectively if we didn't also integrate that with seeing and hearing at the same time. So there are rough approximations of where the brain is active, but the brain tends to be active in a variety of areas all the time. Sometimes you'll hear people say things like, we only use 10% of the brain. I want to be very clear about this. That is a false statement. We use 100% of our brain virtually all of the time. It is not that we have all of this parts of our brain that goes unused. When people were saying we use 10% of our brain, they weren't accounting for the fact that our brain also works to help us to move, to help us to see, to help us to hear, to help us to think, to have emotions, to keep our bodies regulated, keep ourselves able to breathe. It's a very complex instrument. One of the things that we've now begun to learn and focus on better in much of what we're looking at with the brain is that the brain is actually not just organized into lobes and not just individual nerve cells firing, but there are systems that occur. And what that means is that different parts of the brain tend to work together. So nerve cells in one part of the brain, when they're activated, send activation throughout several different areas of the brain. And I'm going to just pause for a moment and spend some time on this because it will be important in helping us to understand how people make decisions about wellness and why it's difficult oftentimes for us to get people to sustain wellness decisions. So I'm going to call your attention in this particular slide, first of all, to an area called the nucleus accumbens. And that's pretty much in the center of the slide. It's tinted a kind of a red. And what you see there are multiple connections to the nucleus accumbens. So the amygdala has connections that go back and forth to the nucleus accumbens. The prefrontal cortex has connections that go back and forth to nucleus accumbens. And what this doesn't show is that there are actually connections up into the parietal area. A whole range of things kind of connect through this particular structure, which appears to take on the function of giving feedback. So, for example, the amygdala, the yellow part towards the bottom of the brain on your screen, is the part of the brain that reacts when some perceived danger occurs. So if you were to walk into a room and something furry with a long tail was scurrying across the floor as you came in, your amygdala would react to that. And if you happen to be afraid of mice or rats, you would immediately react with some level of fear to that visual input, and your amygdala would light up. The amygdala is designed to have this kind of very quick emotional reaction that will help to keep us safe. That sends a signal up to the nucleus accumbens, which then coordinates a kind of an action. In the case of some of you, it might coordinate the action of screaming and jumping onto a table. It might coordinate the action of tracking the little furry object and trying to see what it is, maybe following it, chasing it. But the nucleus accumbens gives the kind of the information out to the different parts of the brain so that things can be processed. One of the places it sends information, and the particular slide doesn't show it, it's clearly going directly back and forth as it might, is it sends information up to the prefrontal cortex. Now, if you think of the prefrontal cortex, that's located right over your eyebrows. That's the very front of the brain. It's kind of an odd name. I don't know why they call it prefrontal, which means essentially before the front. It would make more sense to just call it frontal, but we're stuck with the terms that we have. So this is called the prefrontal cortex, and it's actually the area where you think about things. So you see something furry going across the floor. It has a tail on it, and as you are able to get information through the nucleus accumbens, and which has also sent information to the occipital lobe, you begin to realize that it's just a little wind-up toy and it's not a mouse at all, and the prefrontal cortex then allows you to make sense out of that and think about it. So these systems are connected to each other. Now what happens is that as the amygdala sees danger and sends a signal out, and the prefrontal cortex identifies it then a half a second to a second later as not dangerous. It's just that little wind-up toy that you have that looks like a mouse. The prefrontal cortex then sends another signal back to the nucleus accumbens, which sends a signal that quiets the amygdala back down. So the system allows itself to exercise some level of control as a result of that. Now here's the kicker. The emotional system, the amygdala and surrounding structures that form what's called the limbic system, that area of the brain reacts very rapidly. In fact, it reacts to input at about a rate of 40 milliseconds, which is 40 millionths of a second. In order to form a thought about something, it takes about 80 milliseconds, or approximately twice as long. Now, 80 millionths of a second isn't a very long time, but in brain time, it is an incredibly long period of time. And that means that we have an emotion before we have a thought about something. The implication for that is that oftentimes, if we are not paying attention, emotional reactions begin to drive the system. So our thoughts become interpretations of why we're feeling what we're feeling instead of explanations for what reality is. And if we pause for a moment and we begin to look at the implications for that, let's suppose someone is having chest pains. They go into their doctor. They're diagnosed as having some trouble with their heart, and their doctor says, you know, you were really lucky here. You just barely escaped from a very serious thing, and if you don't change your lifestyle, you're going to die. Well, what this does is it activates the emotional system before it activates the thinking system. So a person then responds in a way that that is a very emotional response. That's a very powerful system. It is designed specifically to manage very clear and immediate threat. But it is also designed to only manage very clear and immediate threat, and that's what becomes an important part of this. So this limbic system reacts to, oh my gosh, I almost died, I need to do something. And predictably, the majority of people who are told that by their doctor make changes in their lifestyle. They eat better, they are willing to do a little bit more exercise, and certainly not everybody, but the majority of people will make changes in their lifestyle following such an event. And those changes typically last 2 to 3 months. The reason for that is that the system is designed for a short-term reaction to the perception of threat. Once the threat seems to be neutralized, the system is designed to go back to your ordinary life, not to sustain that kind of threat over the long term. So when we do studies that look at how people have responded to a cardiac problem, and we do a study at 3 months, many people have made a significant change. They've lost weight, they are exercising better, they're eating better. If we follow those same people for 6 months, most of them have gone back to the lifestyle they lived before this event happened by the 6-month period of time. We have often in the wellness field treated that as people are not motivated to change. What we understand when we look at it from a neurological point of view is that what they have done is reacted very normally to a threat. They had a threat, it captivated their amygdala, it caused them to make some immediate changes. They got to a point where their life was now better, and so the threat is over. It's no longer necessary to sustain those changes, and you can go back to your normal life. And that becomes the real challenge that we often have because of the way these systems work. We're going to talk a little bit about how we make more sustained changes in a minute, but I want you to just kind of look at it quickly through these networks and see how these networks balance each other in order to manage different kinds of things. So the next way we can divide the brain is to divide it between the right and the left. What we've kind of roughly done is talked about the right hemisphere being more involved in holistic kind of thinking, left hemisphere being more logical and more systemic. But there's something else that happens on right and left hemisphere that is actually pretty important and pretty interesting. The work from Dr. Richard Davidson, who's a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, demonstrated that particularly in the right prefrontal cortex, that place where we do our thinking, so the area over our right eye, when somebody is worried, depressed, angry, fearful, the right prefrontal cortex is the place that becomes very activated. So much so that when I was in my graduate training, we were taught that emotions are a right hemisphere activity, and logic was a left hemisphere activity. And it is certainly true that when we look at emotions that are associated with threat, like depression, anxiety, anger, and fear, they are represented in the right prefrontal cortex. He also discovered in his research that when people are in a more calm state, when they're more peaceful, when they're more contented, that actually occurs in the left prefrontal cortex. So that the left part of our brain, just above our left eye, is the place where we feel those more calming, more peaceful emotions. As he was doing this, one of the things that he noted was that individuals who were chronically anxious, who had an anxiety disorder, or who were chronically depressed, or who were chronically angry, actually ended up with a larger right prefrontal cortex. By volume, that part of their brain was actually larger than their left prefrontal cortex. Then, as he was doing this research, he had the opportunity to spend time studying monks who were doing mindfulness meditation. The Dalai Lama contacted him, asked him if he'd be willing to do that. They made agreements that they would bring very well-practiced monks into the laboratory and do some studying to see what mindfulness meditation, what kind of effects that might have on the brain. So one of the things that he noted when he first put these monks through his brain imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging machines, and there were about 12 to 20 monks that participated in that early set of studies, each of whom had an average of 20,000 documented hours of practice in mindfulness meditation. To give you some kind of idea of that, that's about 10 years full-time practice, 8 hours a day of meditation. What he discovered was that these individuals had enormous left prefrontal cortexes. They were like freaks of nature. So the question that came up with that was, is it possible that people who are chronically anxious, chronically depressed, chronically angry, perhaps they are born with a brain that has this larger right prefrontal cortex, and as a result, they're kind of stuck with these kinds of emotions all the time. And that these people who have these large left prefrontal cortexes are more likely to become monks and meditate more, and are more likely to be successful in these processes? Or is it possible that the brain is adapting to these two things? And so what Dr. Davidson did in his research is he found a company just outside of Madison that was willing to participate in a research study. And so everyone had their brain's image before the study started. Half of the company then were put through 8 weeks of mindfulness training. This is an 8-week course that involves learning to meditate and practicing it relatively intensely over the period of time. And it's essentially based on work by John Kabat-Zinn out of the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, and very well researched. And then at the end of those 8 weeks, everyone went back through the brain imaging a second time. What they discovered was that in 8 weeks of training, the left prefrontal cortex in those who had been given mindfulness training had grown in size. This research has been confirmed in a variety of other areas, and one of the things that it has helped us to understand is that the brain, in fact, adapts to the kind of life that we live. And so people who are anxious and angry and depressed all the time begin to have a brain that supports those kinds of reactions. If you think about it, if you went into the gym and it was a really poor gym, so they didn't have much equipment, they only had dumbbells, so you picked up a dumbbell with your right arm, and every day you came in and you exercised your right arm with the set of dumbbells, you'd end up with a very well-developed right arm, and your left arm would be pretty weak. Well, then as you went through your daily life, if you need to pick something up, what are you going to do? You're going to pick it up with your right arm, because that's the arm that is the most functional. Perhaps that's what people are doing in their lives. They are constantly stressed out. They're constantly put in situations where they're taught to be afraid or worry or be aggressive or whatever. And so not only do they develop a stronger right prefrontal cortex, but they begin to interpret everything in their life through that lens. So when something neutral happens, they look at it through the eyes of fear or depression or anger, because that's the part of their brain that's most functional. By contrast, if you went back into the gym and said, well, I'm going to start building up my left arm, you could do that. You could train your left arm to get strong again and even itself out so that it would be equally functioning to your right arm. And that is, in fact, the function of systematic training of the brain, is to help us to be able to bring the brain into shape so that people have the capacity in their daily lives, their regular lives, to think about their lives and interact in their lives in new and more helpful, more healthy ways. This has another implication. One of the things that people will sometimes do with me is they'll say, you know, our company has really got a lot of stress. Can you come in, and I've had this happen more than once, can you give us a presentation on getting better with stress? We've got about a half hour. Can you do it in that period of time? And the answer, quite frankly, and I've told this to a number of companies, the answer is no, I can't. Any more than I could come in and improve someone's cardiovascular fitness by taking them on a half-hour walk. we have to begin to think about training the brain as something that has to be sustained over the long term, in the same way that I have to sustain my cardiovascular system. It isn't good enough for me to have walked once last year and therefore my cardiovascular system is in good shape. That's a regular activity that I have to engage in. What we've learned about the brain is we have to engage in regular activity as well to be able to access more of the joy and peace and contentment in our lives, to not only interact with things through anxiety or fear or anger, and that requires that people have the ability to sustain their training of the brain over the long term. One more part of the brain that is kind of an interesting thing is that the brain is actually organized. So we've gone at the net level of the nerve cell. We've gone at the surface level and look, how the surface looks. We've divided it into two parts. We can also look at deep level neurons and more surface neurons, and it turns out that nerve cells at these different levels actually do different things. So we have nerve cells that are responsible for the bare sensory experiences that we have. When you see something, there are certain nerve cells that pick up impulses of light and translate into making those nerve cells give off signals to other nerve cells. As that organization progresses up the brain, those impulses are combined with other impulses. So for example, we have nerve cells that only see horizontal lines. We have other nerve cells that only see vertical lines. So when we look at a box, we actually have to have more than one set of nerve cells that light up in order to combine the perception so that we can see horizontal and vertical and then depth as well. On the next level up, we combine those nerve cells with the ability to move towards something that has a complex visual information or move away from it, to have smooth movements. So we have all kinds of combinations between occipital lobe and parietal lobe and temporal lobe, as I talked about before. And then on the highest level, we have nerve cells that try to make sense out of it all, so that it actually tells stories about how things work based on previous experiences. So you can see a furry thing with a long tail and make sense out of what it is based on what you're seeing, watching the movement, the kind of reaction you have to it, and the memories you have of other furry things running across the floor with long tails. So there are many levels of complex systems. One of the things that happens, though, is that means that oftentimes having new experience is difficult because we're always interpreting it and trying to find patterns based on our past experiences. And so there's a certain resistance to change that's built into a system because of the way that's structured, and because we're always trying to compare it to things that we've had before, we've experienced before, and we're trying to already know what something is. And so when something new comes along, it's actually an emotionally difficult experience for us because it feels like we don't have a category to put it in. And that's in part because of the way our nerve cells are organized. So I know that it takes a while to get through all of that, but it's important to have kind of that basic understanding so that we can take a look at how that interacts with our wellness programming. The first implication for that is that we actually need to be thinking about training your brain. in the same way that we train our bodies, in the same way that we try to get our nutrition in line so that we can work and effectively manage our physical bodies, our brain responds to our environment. It grows and changes throughout our life. You are adding new nerve cells during this webinar, and you will add new ones all day long, depending on the experiences that you have. And you are always training your brain. So to the extent that you are bored today, you're training your brain that when you hear my voice, it's a boring thing and you should tune out from it. To the extent that you find yourself learning something new and being intrigued by it, you're training the curiosity system of your brain, and we get better at what we practice. And this is actually very important. So if I get better at wishing I were in a different part of my life, if I were older, younger, had more money or whatever, I get better at wishing. I don't get better at being in that other part of my life. I get better at wishing. If I am training my brain to be grateful, I get better at being grateful. One of the things that people often say when they're first learning a new skill like meditation or being grateful or being more positive is they will say, I'm no good at this. Well, of course you're not. You haven't ever practiced it before. You'll get better at it as you practice it. And that's an important principle that we have to understand, that we can train our brain and we will get better at it over time. There are ways that our systems resist changing. So one of the things that the deep parts of our brain, the emotional parts of our brain, are doing is they are trying to keep us safe. By safe, one of the things that means is don't investigate too many new things all at once. And when you get new things, make sure you're not moving too fast. Change takes time. Positive thinking is never fully possible. I see this all the time. I had a person I was working with a few weeks ago, and one of the things we did is we spent some time in our weekly session reviewing the progress that she had made. Well, one of the things that did for her is it made her review all of the progress that she hadn't made yet, because the brain wants to do that. It wants to see the things that still might be threats. And so when we start trying to think positively, it triggers negative thinking to go along with it. That's not an entirely bad thing. If you were always positive, you would lose the capacity to keep yourself safe. We need a certain percentage of the ability to be afraid or experience loss or even get angry in order to be able to manage an environment that actually does have some threat to it. When I say that there's a certain percentage, we've actually identified what that percentage is. And I'm going to kind of go ahead here and I'll come back to it. The percentage is 3 to 1. Actually, it's 2.9714 to 1, but we won't squabble about the data. And this comes from actually 7 different places in independent research that people have come up with the same positive to negative ratio. When we have approximately 3 positive occurrences in our lives to 1 negative occurrence in our lives, we have a subjective sense that we are doing well and growing rather than just surviving, or even worse, that we're barely making it and we're under severe threat. So when the negative to positive ratio is higher than 1 to 1, more negatives than positives, we feel like we are under attack and barely making it. When it becomes even, one-to-one, positive to negative, we feel like we have to be cautious because there's the potential for something bad to happen at any moment. And even though we don't feel quite as threatened, we don't feel safe. It's when we get to the 3-to-1 ratio that we really find ourselves feeling like we can grow and thrive and prosper. And that's because of the ways our brains are structured. So I'm going to just go back here a second. So change is hard, and it doesn't happen by accident. What happens is that when we are not working on changing, we are staying essentially the same. And you've all had the experience. You know, you decide, okay, I'm going to try this new exercise. It looks like it'll be really fun. And if I don't really pay attention to it, I'll do a little bit of this new exercise, and then I'll compensate for that by spending a little bit more time sitting around doing nothing to balance it off. If I am on a diet, I tend to not do as many activities so I don't burn as many calories, because our bodies have the tendency to try to stay in a balanced state rather than changing. Changing requires intentional decisions. It is part of the conscious system. As a result, it takes effort. Oftentimes when I'm working with people and I make a suggestion, they'll look at me and they'll say, well, that would be hard, as if it were hard, I shouldn't have to do it. But the reality is that all of the changes that people are trying to make are hard. And I don't know about you, but I've never done anything in my life that I felt was worthwhile that wasn't something that was hard. So hard is part of the way things work. Don't apologize if you're asking people to do hard things. So one of the things that I think we do wrong very often in our wellness programs is we have traditionally, because of where wellness has come from, wellness came out of a medical model. The medical model looks at the problem, the disease, the threat, and then tries to get people to make changes in their lives to reduce the threat. And from a medical perspective, we do that actually pretty well. What ends up happening, though, is what we described earlier on. When the threat then is less prominent, people want to go back to the life they've lived before. They want to go back to their regular life. So we have this great struggle that we often find ourselves engaging in, trying to convince people to make sustained change by telling them that there's a threat here and there's a threat there and there's a threat here and there's a threat there. And what we know about the brain is that that will never result in sustained change, because our systems are not set up to work that way. When we interact with people on that basis, what we are training them to do is to remove the threat so they can get back to their regular life. And they will continually do that for us. We have to make a shift in the way that we think about it. And in fact, what we need to do instead is start to help people to develop a sense that they can have a different interaction with their lives. We need to train them to help them to become more connected to that part of their brain that generates peace and contentment and happiness excuse me, as the reason for becoming well. I look at the way people live their lives, and I actually think that everyone wants to live their lives in a healthier and more well way. The problem isn't that they don't want to. The problem is that they are always dealing with threats, and they develop that part of their brain that deals with threats so that they begin to see threats that aren't even there anymore, and they don't know how to sustain that sense of peace and joy and contentment because that part of their brain hasn't been developed well enough yet. So we do it by helping people to learn to be more curious in their lives, to explore things, and as they feel safe in their lives, that's kind of a natural thing that people will want to do. They will want to be more curious, they will want to learn, and that's a natural human occurrence. If you don't believe that people are curious, watch a 3-year-old. They can't stop themselves from being curious about everything. They get into that period of time in their lives where whatever you tell them, they're going to ask why. Why is the sky blue? Well, why is it that the sun reflects those rays, and why is it that they can't stop doing that? They're very curious. There's a part of us that wants to be curious, and we need to tap into that for people. We need to help people to develop in a systematic way the part of their brain that helps them to recognize that there is the capacity for peace, there is the capacity for contentment and joy, and the best way we know how to do it right now, maybe there will be new ways that we'll discover, the best way we know how to do it right now is to learn to meditate. It is a powerful thing, and it is something that people can do on a regular basis and an ongoing basis that actually changes the structure of their brain and supports a healthier, more well lifestyle. We've talked about moving from a negative view to a positive view and sustaining that in that 3-to-1 ratio. And so we want to make sure that we can do some of that kind of training, recognizing that the brain is more like a muscle than we ever thought. So I'm going to take some time at this point. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I've kind of run through a lot of things, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask a couple of questions, and in the absence of that, I can always fill in some more information. But we'll pause just for a second here so that you can list some questions, and I know Michaela has the availability to kind of take some more directly too, and we'll spend some time with that.
Yeah, so if you'd like to raise your hand, I can unmute your microphone and you can speak directly to John, or if that just seems like a tremendously scary thing to do, you can type in your question and I can read it. Read it to John. John, as you were talking, I was thinking we had some friends over a few weeks ago, and we were sitting around in the evening. They stayed with us for the weekend, and one of those, I don't know, CSI kind of programs came on, and I, immediately changed the channel, and they're kind of like, well, we really like that. And I'm like, no, I don't let that stuff into my head. And I thought about that in terms of what you just said, because, that stuff is totally scary to me. I mean, I believe it it obviously exists in the world, but it doesn't have to be in my head.
Yeah, we got some strains of research that are starting to address this, and I don't know if I can stretch the research enough to make it kind of blanket statements yet, but it does appear in many ways that that exposure to those kinds of things in the media have a particular kind of impact on people. So when people watch more crime programs, they feel less safe, even in neighborhoods where crime rates have dropped. Because what we tend to do, whether we like it or not, is we tend to we know that it's just a television set, and we know that it's just a story, but our brain reacts to it as if it's real. And so it starts to activate all of those kinds of parts of our brain. Then what happens is that the brain begins to adjust to that, so that a crime drama seems normal unless you get more gore or more bizarre to get a higher reaction. So over time, what I've seen is that you no longer talk about a murder. Now you show a murder. You no longer just show a murder, but you show a murder and then you put it under a close-up, and it's getting more and more and more. And what the attempt is to get the same kind of reaction that you used to get when you just talked about it, because the brain is constantly adapting to those things. In the same way, I think that if I go into the gym and I start lifting a 5-pound weight, after a while the 5-pound weight doesn't do it anymore. I need a 10-pound weight. And after a while I need a 15-pound weight to get the same kind of feeling, because I'm getting stronger in that area, and so it takes more to get the same result. And that the implications of that are actually kind of frightening, because it may be that unintentionally we're creating a situation in which people are activating that part of their brains that keep them focused on the negative and keep them afraid, and make it less likely that they will feel like they have the capacity to become well.
Let's see, we have Claire. Claire has said she really loved the animation cartoon of the brain lifting weights. That was very cute. She also said that, just a comment, that movement therapy has been proven to increase limbic brain activity.
It does.
Yeah. So
what's interesting about that, Kelly Lambert, who's a neuroscientist, has identified that there's a connection from the amygdala, which is the fear center, the place where we feel some of those intense emotions, and the nucleus accumbens. And the prefrontal cortex then can quiet the nucleus accumbens, which then quiets the amygdala. But an equal connection occurs between the nucleus accumbens and some areas of the parietal lobe that are particularly focused, that can have the same benefit. And the part of the brain that seems to work best are movements that people use with their hands that create something that have some purpose or meaning in their lives. And that's an interesting thing. So that Kelly Lambert has been able to show, for example, that when people make clothes, it quiets their amygdala and helps them to feel better, the act of sewing. When they chop vegetables, it makes them feel more calm and more content in their lives. When they garden, it actually has a positive emotional benefit. And that's an interesting thing, because we often overlook that. There may be benefits beyond just eating healthy, in that preparing a healthy meal involves many activities that that allow you to use your hands in productive ways and make you feel better emotionally, as well as giving you some benefits physically from the nutrition.
Isn't that interesting?
It is.
Let's see, we have a few more questions. Let's see. Are there some this is from Joanne, are there some strategies for increasing positive thoughts, decreasing negative, that have been shown effective, like do gratitude journals or positive affirmations help?
Gratitude seems to be much more, in the research shows much more benefit than positive affirmations, probably because gratitude requires that you interact with your life in some very, very specific ways, that you're trying to notice and develop a sense of connection to things that are actually going on in your life. And it is, from a research standpoint, the quickest way that you can shift your mood and feel more positive. When you do this over the long term, it has some really intriguing benefits, and that would be another topic that we might want to explore at some future point, because we're going to run out of time. But I'd like to give you a really practical way to make this work. So at the end of every day, sit down and ask yourself 2 questions. What went well today, and why did it go well? If you can, journal about those 2 things. So what went well, and why did it go well? Every day, good and bad things happen. So you can always sit at the end of the day and say what didn't go well and find something. But even in bad days, you can find something that went well, and you can find something that went well every day. When we do that, we develop the ability to really notice the things that are going well in our lives. We become more grateful. We become more connected to the positive things in our lives. And because we're looking at how they occurred, we are finding ways to replicate those things better in the future, because if I know why it went well, I can do it again and do it in other situations. So it's a very powerful way to bring that positivity more effectively into our daily lives.
Well, I think that's a wonderful message, and probably a wonderful way to end this. We will have to have you back, though, John. Just you mentioning it has caused a few people to say, yes, please come back. So you're welcome anytime.
Well,
so
thanks,
we
Michael.
will get you on the schedule again.
I always appreciate it. Good.
Good. Well,
thank you. Thank you, everybody, for participating today.
And thank you so much, John, and everyone have a lovely weekend, and I hope I see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye now.